My daughter came home from her grandmother's house and told me, in a small, confused voice, that she wasn't allowed to call her grandma anymore. Not because she'd done something wrong. Because she wouldn't hand over her toy to a cousin who wasn't even hers to please. That's the moment I stopped being the patient daughter-in-law. That's the moment I became someone my mother-in-law should have been afraid of a long time ago. My name is Mary. I'm 35 years old, and what I did next, I don't regret for one single second. But before I tell you how I took away something my mother-in-law valued more than any grandchild, more than any family gathering, more than her own son's marriage, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching this from. I read every single one, and trust me, you're going to want to be part of this story when it's over. Let me back up. I married into a family that looked perfect from the outside. Big house on a cul-de-sac, holiday photos with matching sweaters, a mother-in-law, I'll call her Eleanor, who baked pies for the church bake sale and hosted Sunday dinners like she was running for mayor of niceness. Everyone in town adored Eleanor. She volunteered at the library. She sat on the board of the community garden. She was, by every outward measure, a pillar. What nobody saw was the version of Eleanor that came out behind closed doors, the one who measured love in transactions. Eleanor didn't give affection freely. She rationed it. She doled it out like a landlord doles out heat in the winter, just enough to keep you from freezing to death, never enough to let you get comfortable. And the person who learned this lesson hardest, harder than me, harder than my husband Ben, was my 9-year-old daughter, Sophie. Sophie is gentle. She's the kind of kid who cries when a worm is stranded on the sidewalk after rain and insists on moving it to the grass. She shares her lunch with kids who forgot theirs. She's kind in a way that some adults never manage to be in their entire lives. And Eleanor, for reasons I'm still unpacking, decided that Sophie's kindness was a weakness to be corrected. It started small. A comment here, a comparison there. Eleanor had another grandchild on her daughter's side, a boy a year older than Sophie, and Eleanor made no effort to hide who she preferred. Sophie would bring home a piece of artwork from Eleanor's house and I'd notice the frame was cheaper than the one hanging in Eleanor's hallway for the other grandson. Small things. The kind of things you tell yourself you're imagining because the alternative, that your mother-in-law plays favorites with children, feels too petty and too cruel to be real. Then came the birthday party. It was Sophie's 9th birthday, and Eleanor had gotten her a set of art markers, the kind Sophie had been begging for. Sophie was thrilled. She opened them at the party, sitting cross-legged on Eleanor's living room floor, and her cousin, the favored grandson, reached over and asked to use one. Sophie, being Sophie, handed over the whole set without a second thought. "You can use all of them," she said. "I'll share." That should have been the end of it. A sweet moment. A grandmother watching her granddaughter's generosity with pride. Instead, Eleanor knelt down, took the markers back from the cousin, placed them back in Sophie's lap, and said, in front of every single person in that room, "No, sweetheart. Those are yours. You don't have to share with him. He has his own things at home." Sophie, confused, said okay, and offered them again anyway, because that's who she is. She held the markers out toward her cousin a second time. And that's when Eleanor said it. The line that started everything. "No sharing, no grandma." She said it light, almost sing-song, like it was a cute little rule, a joke between the two of them. But Sophie's face didn't take it as a joke. Sophie's face crumpled, because in her 9-year-old mind, her grandmother had just told her that being generous, the thing she'd been taught her whole life was good, would cost her Eleanor's love. I wasn't in the room when it happened. I was in the kitchen with a tray of cupcakes. I only heard about it because Sophie told me in the car on the way home, staring out the window, asking me in this small, uncertain voice, "Mommy, is it bad that I wanted to share?" I nearly drove off the road. I want you to understand something about me before I tell you what happened next. I am not a vengeful person by nature. I forgive easily. I give people the benefit of the doubt past the point where most people would have walked away. I had absorbed years of Eleanor's subtle jabs, her backhanded compliments about my cooking, her comments about how some mothers just don't have the instinct, her habit of correcting my parenting in front of Sophie like I wasn't even in the room. I let all of it go. I told myself she was from a different generation, that she meant well, that Ben loved his mother, and I didn't want to be the wife who came between a man and his family. But there's a line. And the line is my daughter. Nobody, not Eleanor, not anyone on this earth, gets to make my 9-year-old feel like her kindness is conditional on being loved back. Nobody gets to weaponize a grandmother's affection as a bargaining chip against a child. That night, after Sophie was asleep, I sat Ben down and told him everything. To his credit, my husband was horrified. He'd grown up with his mother's favoritism, he had a sister, and Eleanor had always preferred her, in the same quiet, corrosive way she now preferred Sophie's cousin. Ben knew exactly what this pattern looked like because he'd lived inside it for 30-some years. He just hadn't thought his mother would turn it on his own daughter. "I'll talk to her," he said. "You've talked to her before," I said. "About the comments. About the comparisons. Nothing changes." He didn't have an answer for that, because he knew I was right. Eleanor had been gently confronted a dozen times over the years, and every time, she'd cried, called herself unappreciated, and gone right back to doing exactly what she'd always done. Talking wasn't going to fix this. Eleanor didn't respond to conversation. Eleanor responded to consequences. So I decided to give her one. Here's something you need to know about Eleanor, something that mattered more to her than almost anything else in her life, her legacy. Eleanor was 71 years old, a widow for 6 years, and sitting on a modest but respectable estate, the house, some savings, a life insurance policy, a small portfolio her late husband had built. Eleanor talked about the family legacy the way other people talk about religion. She loved hosting conversations at Sunday dinner about who would carry on the family name, who deserved what, who had earned their place in her will. She used the idea of inheritance as a leash. Behave the way she wanted, get in line with her opinions, mirror her preferences, and you'd be taken care of. Step out of line, and she'd remind you, subtly, that nothing was guaranteed. She had, in fact, done exactly this to Ben more than once. When we bought our house without asking for her input on the neighborhood, she'd made an offhand comment about some people needing to remember where their support comes from. When I went back to work after maternity leave instead of staying home like she thought I should, she'd sighed and said something about priorities in a way that was clearly meant to be overheard. Eleanor's love language, at the end of the day, was leverage. And I decided if that's the game she wanted to play, I would play it better than she ever imagined I could. I want to be clear about something. I did not fabricate anything. I did not lie, manipulate documents, or do anything remotely illegal. What I did was far simpler, and far more devastating, because it was built entirely on truth. The first thing I did was talk to Ben's sister, the mother of the favored cousin. I'd always assumed she and I were, if not close, at least civil. What I learned in that conversation changed everything. It turned out Eleanor had been playing both of us against each other for years. She told my sister-in-law that I was difficult and controlling with Sophie. She told me that my sister-in-law was jealous of how well Ben and I were doing. She'd been quietly seeding resentment between two women who, once we actually sat down and compared notes, realized we had far more in common than Eleanor had ever wanted us to know. We started talking. Really talking. And what came out of those conversations was a pattern going back over a decade, instances where Eleanor had pitted her children and grandchildren against one another, always positioning herself as the prize to be won, always making sure nobody in the family trusted each other enough to compare stories. The second thing I did was start documenting. Every comment, every incident, every time Eleanor conditioned her affection on a child's behavior, I wrote it down, with dates, with witnesses where possible. Not for a court case. Not for anything dramatic. I did it because I needed, for my own sanity, to see the pattern laid out in black and white, undeniable, impossible to explain away as she's just old-fashioned. The third thing, and this is where it gets good, involved Eleanor's estate attorney. Eleanor had, for years, talked openly about wanting to update her will to reflect the family as it currently stands. She'd been putting it off, mostly because updating a will meant actually deciding, on paper, who she loved and how much, and Eleanor liked keeping that ambiguous. Ambiguity was power. As long as nobody knew exactly where they stood, everybody had to keep performing for her. Ben, as it happened, had power of attorney designated as a backup on some of Eleanor's paperwork from years earlier, back when his father passed and things needed to move quickly. It had never been revoked, mostly because Eleanor trusted Ben more than anyone else in the family, and because updating that kind of document required an appointment she kept avoiding. Ben wasn't using this power. He'd forgotten it even existed. But I hadn't. I didn't ask Ben to abuse this position. That's important. What I did instead was far more elegant. I asked Ben to simply be present, really present, for one specific conversation. I arranged, through Ben, a family meeting. I framed it to Eleanor as a chance to finally sit down and talk about the family legacy she loved discussing so much, to put concrete plans in place, to make everyone's role clear, to stop the ambiguity that, I gently suggested, was causing tension among the grandchildren. Eleanor loved this idea. Of course she did. It gave her center stage, an audience, and the chance to dangle her estate in front of her children one more time. What Eleanor didn't know was that I had spent the 2 weeks prior having quiet, careful conversations with everyone who would be in that room. My sister-in-law. Ben. Even, gently and age-appropriately, Sophie's cousin, who at 11 years old was old enough to understand that something wasn't fair, even if he couldn't articulate exactly what. The meeting happened on a Sunday, the same living room where Eleanor had told my daughter that her love was conditional. Eleanor sat in her usual chair, the one that faced the room like a throne, and she began the conversation the way I knew she would, talking about legacy, about family values, about who had shown up for her over the years in the ways that mattered. And I let her talk. I let her get about 10 minutes into her speech about the importance of family loyalty before I asked, calmly, Eleanor, can I ask you something? Do you remember what you said to Sophie at her birthday party? The room went quiet. Eleanor blinked, clearly not expecting to be interrupted, and said something dismissive about not remembering every little thing she says to grandchildren. You told her, no sharing, no grandma. In front of everyone. Because she offered to share her birthday present with her cousin. Eleanor's face did something complicated, a flicker of defensiveness, quickly papered over with a laugh. Oh, that was just a little joke. Sophie's fine. She asked me that night if it was bad that she wanted to share, I said. She's 9, Eleanor. She thought her own kindness might cost her your love. I watched my sister-in-law's face change as I spoke, watched her realize, in real time, that what had happened to her son over the years, the subtle conditioning, the comparisons, the way Eleanor had made both our children compete for a grandmother's approval instead of simply receiving it, was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern. And once one person names a pattern out loud, in a room full of people who've all quietly experienced their own version of it, something breaks open that can't be put back together. My sister-in-law spoke next, and what she said undid Eleanor in a way I hadn't even planned for. She told her own story, how Eleanor had told her son, years earlier, that he'd get extra dessert if he stopped inviting a particular cousin to play, how she'd used treats and privileges as tools to make children choose sides in a family that should never have had sides to begin with. Eleanor tried to recover. She tried the tears, the wounded matriarch routine that had worked on all of us for years. I don't understand why everyone is ganging up on me. Everything I've done out of love. And this is the part one want you to really hear, because it's the heart of everything. I looked at her and I said, love doesn't come with conditions, Eleanor. Love that has to be earned by excluding someone else isn't love. It's control. And I will not let you teach my daughter that being kind makes her less worthy of being loved. Then I said the thing that actually changed the outcome of that meeting. You wanted to talk about legacy today. So let's talk about it honestly. If you want a family that shows up for you the way you claim to want, you need to earn that the same way anyone earns trust, by treating every single person in this family, child and adult, with the same unconditional respect. Not by dangling your house and your savings over our heads like a leash. We're not performing for an inheritance. We never should have been asked to. Eleanor didn't update her will that day the way she'd planned. In fact, the meeting she had orchestrated to reassert her control over the family ended with her sitting in stunned silence while two daughters-in-law who used to barely speak now sat side by side, united, laying out a decade of receipts. Here's the revenge, if you want to call it that, though I think of it more as accountability. In the weeks that followed, Ben quietly had that outdated power of attorney formally revoked, at Eleanor's own attorney's recommendation. Once Eleanor herself, humbled and shaken, agreed it made sense to update her documents properly with a lawyer present rather than leave things informal. It wasn't an act of theft. It was the simple, natural result of a family finally refusing to let one woman's manipulation dictate the terms of their relationships. Eleanor no longer got to hint and imply and dangle. Everything was formalized, transparent, and equal, every grandchild treated identically in writing, with no ambiguity left for her to exploit. But the real consequence, the one that actually mattered to Eleanor more than any dollar amount, was this: the mystique was gone. The fear that had kept everyone performing for her approval evaporated the moment we named it out loud in that room. Eleanor was no longer the queen holding court over a family desperate for her favor. She was just a woman who had to learn, at 71 years old, how to earn love instead of ration it. Sophie doesn't know most of this. She's 9. What she knows is that a few months later, her grandmother sat her down, alone, and apologized, actually apologized, not the performative kind, but a real one, with tears that weren't for show. Eleanor told her that sharing is one of the best things about her, and that she was sorry she'd ever made her think otherwise. I don't know if Eleanor has fully changed. People who've spent 7 decades wielding control as love rarely transform overnight. But I know she's careful now. I know she thinks twice before she opens her mouth around my daughter. And I know that the next time anyone in that family hears the words "no sharing, no grandma," it won't be a threat anymore. It'll just be a memory of the day one mother decided her daughter's kindness was worth more than any inheritance, any approval, any fragile peace built on fear. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to protect your own child from someone who was supposed to protect them instead, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because there are more stories where this one came from, stories about the moments ordinary women decide enough is enough, and what happens when they finally stop staying quiet. I'll see you in the next one.